In this movie, I want to consider the issue of pixel to world scale, orthographic cameras, and making sure that your sprites appear on screen as you intend them to. If I open up the textures folder here, you will see that in the previous movie we converted these textures to be a 2D UI type, and this allows the textures to use their native size and to look correct, and you can see those here in the preview panel. Now all of these different textures here have been converted to what Unity internally calls a sprite. That means they can be added to the scene as a separate and independent sprite object. For example, I can grab the platform texture here, drag and drop it. Now I can't drag and drop it into the scene viewport as I can with many other objects, but I can drag and drop it into the hierarchy panel over here, release my mouse, and when I do that you can see that this has now been added to the scene as a sprite object. And I can do this with all the other textures here. So here is another one, drag and drop that into here, and here is another one, and things are just looking splendid. So I'm just going to delete that. Now we know these objects, or these textures here for example, represent the backgrounds to the level. So here we have the background for level 1, here for level 2, and here for level 3. These are three different looking backgrounds, but we can drag and drop them into the level to constitute the background for our scene. Now notice here in the object inspector when I select this texture that we have a setting that says pixels per unit, and this tells us how many pixels in the texture will correspond or fit into one world unit. So here we have 100 pixels of this texture will correspond to one world unit in the scene. Now you'll notice that if I switch over to the game tab here, you can see the world view as seen from the main camera. And if I drag and drop the background into the hierarchy panel to add that to the scene, you can see how that looks here in the game tab. Now notice that our viewport here in the game tab is sized at 1024 by 600. And if I select this texture here in the project panel, you can see that this is also 1024 by 600. And yet, despite that, this background is not appearing full screen when it should do. We can see that this texture should take up the entirety of the screen, but what we in fact get is this object here and then the world surrounding it. This tells us that this scene and this camera is not now set up to display things at a one-to-one scale. It is showing the sprite that we have loaded here, but it is not the case that 1 pixel in this texture represents 1 pixel in the game view here. This is not displaying at the correct size. So the question really amounts to this: how can we configure the scene and or the texture so that when I drag and drop it to add it to the scene, it appears at a one-to-one scale? The answer to that is to change some configuration settings with the game camera. So I'm going to select the main camera here in the hierarchy panel by clicking on that here, and you can see that we get a range of different settings. Now the first thing that we want to take a look at is the projection type. You can see here that the projection type is set to perspective, and that is good for displaying objects in perspective, that is in 3D. But since we're making a 2D game, I want to change the projection type from perspective to orthographic. So I'm going to click on orthographic, and when I do that, the view here in the viewport changes just a little bit. Now we have our main camera, which is centered here at the origin, and we have our object, the sprite object, which is also centered at the origin, so that this camera is aligned, or its field of view, its center of view is aligned to the center of this texture. And if I move down here to the setting underneath projection, which is called size, and I click and drag inside that box to change the size, you can see that this seems to have an important effect on how this texture appears in the game tab. Now I could change this setting just a little bit until it looked roughly right here in the game tab, but I don't need to do that because this number should be a particular number, and it should in fact be half the vertical resolution of the game. Now if we look at the resolution of the game, you can see here it is 1024 by 600. That is 600 is the vertical, the height of the game. Now half of that is 300. So let's see what happens if I type 300 into the size field. We get this. We can see at the center we have a tiny texture at the center. Now, the reason that this value is way too large is because it should be divided by the pixels to world unit scale that is applied to the texture. So if I select our texture here in the object inspector, you can see the pixels per unit is 100. So we should in fact be dividing that value by 100. So I'm going to select the main camera, and 300 divided by 100 is 3. And I'm going to press enter on the keyboard. Now what this has done is it has set this resolution exactly to the right size now, so that this texture is now displaying full screen at the correct size, and this is now appearing at a 1:1 scale, 1 pixel per world unit. And this works no matter how much I resize the viewport. Notice I'm resizing it here, I'm expanding it out this way, and I'm expanding it out that way, and the image resizes to fit the target resolution. And this is the way that we can have all of our textures appear at a 1:1 scale. For example, if I delete this level background and I drag and drop, for example, the gem into the scene here, this is now appearing at a 1:1 scale. And if I drag and drop this house into here, this is appearing at a 1:1 scale. And the same for all of the backgrounds. Everything now is appearing at the correct size. So when we choose our cameras, we want to make sure they're orthographic and that the size value is half the vertical resolution divided by the pixel per unit scale. So that's how you can configure your camera to display your 2D textures at a 1:1 ratio.